We are going to start out by looking at blood as we begin studying the cardiovascular system. Out of all the different kinds of tissues in our body, blood is actually the only one that would be a fluid. It is classified as a type of connective tissue. And if you choose to take anatomy 2, we do spend some time looking at the different tissues in our body. For the components of blood, it's going to include living cells as well as a non-living matrix. The living cells are the formed elements. There's going to be our red and white blood cells as well as platelets, and we'll talk about each of those individually. And the non-living matrix is called plasma. That's the liquid part of our blood. If you were to take a blood sample and put it into a centrifuge is a machine that you would put a test tubes in it, and it spins it around to separate the different components. If we did that with blood, the test tube would start out looking like this on the right, and once we took it out of the centrifuge, it would look like what we have on the left here. And that lets you see the different parts of blood. So all of this down here, the dark red that we see, which makes up about 45% of our total blood volume, if we have normal blood, those would be the erythrocytes, or our red blood cells. That percentage, which again should be 45%, is known as hematocrit, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This thin layer right here, looks kind of fuzzy, is called the buffy coat, and that's going to have our leukocytes, which are our white blood cells, and our platelets, which help with blood clotting. That layer should make up less than 1% of our total blood volume, and it would form when we centrifuge blood in between the erythrocytes down here at the bottom and the plasma up here at the top. So the plasma should rise to the top after the blood is separated, and that should make up 55% of our total blood volume if we have normal blood. So again, here we just have that picture. This would be an example of a centrifuge, so you can see how it would spin the blood samples around. This again on the right would be how your blood would enter the centrifuge in the test tube, and on the left would be what it would look like when it comes out. Again, down here we have our red blood cells. This area right here, the buffy coat, would be your white blood cells and your platelets. And then up here, this yellow looking liquid is the plasma, or the liquid part of our blood. Here we can just see a picture representation along with some numbers and functions. So your red blood cells, you should have in a cubic millimeter of blood, which is about a drop of blood, between 4 and 6 million red blood cells, and their job is to help transport oxygen to all of our cells and carbon dioxide away from all of our cells. You can see here there are different kinds of leukocytes, or white blood cells. They should be between 4,800 and 10,800. They help to defend us against infection. There are, again, different kinds. They have different jobs. Another thing we do in anatomy 2 is look at the immune system, which is my favorite system to cover. Cardiovascular is my second favorite, but we go over what each of those types of white blood cells do specifically. And then we have platelets. Should have between 250,000 and 400,000 of those in a drop of blood, and they help with blood clotting. So if you get a cut, they're what helps stop the bleeding. So here we are back at talking about hematocrit. Again, it's a measure of the percentage of red blood cells in our blood, and we will be doing a lab on hematocrit in the near future. So you'll get a little bit more look at that then. But a normal hematocrit should be around 45%. Anywhere between 37 and 45% is considered normal. A little on the lower range there, or the lower part of that range, would be normal for females, and the upper portion of that range would be more normal for males. If somebody has a low hematocrit, what that could mean is that they are anemic or they have anemia. That means that they are lacking blood. So it can either be a sign of some kind of disease or some kind of blood loss, like maybe some type of internal bleeding, for example. Somebody has an ulcer in their stomach and they're losing blood there. That can be a sign of, or something that would cause anemia. If somebody has high hematocrit, that's called polycythemia. High hematocrit means you have too many red blood cells, and that's going to cause your blood to become thickened. And if your blood is thickened, it's very easy to form a blood clot. And we'll talk in tomorrow's lesson more about some problems that can arise with undesirable blood clots or blood stopping bleeding when we don't want that to happen, essentially. If we look at the physical characteristics of our blood, your blood is red. It's just different shades of red depending on where in your body it would be found. Sometimes people think we have blue blood, and we actually don't. We will, especially when we do a diagram of the heart when we get to that in a couple weeks. You're going to see blue and red on diagrams. The blue is used to represent oxygen poor blood, but that blood in our bodies is actually a dull or a dark red. And then the red on diagrams represents oxygen rich blood, which in our bodies would be a bright scarlet red. The reason why sometimes people think we have blue blood is if you look at your arm, your veins tend to look blue, but that coloring just comes from the color of your skin over top of your veins. So again, oxygen-rich blood that is picking up oxygen from your lungs and taking it to the rest of your body, taking that oxygen to the rest of your body is going to be a bright scarlet red. Oxygen-poor blood that's coming back to your heart from the rest of your body is going to be a dark or a dull red. If you ever have had blood drawn before, they take blood from your vein. So that blood, if you look at the test tubes when they do that, you'll see that is a dark red blood. But if you were to cut your finger, for example, or if you were to get a cut somewhere else and that blood is coming from a vein, that blood is going to look bright red, but it's because it's hitting the oxygen in the air. So as soon as blood hits oxygen, whether it's in your body or outside, it's going to react with that blood and change color into that bright red. The pH of your blood needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45. It's because you've got different factors in your blood, and chemical reactions need to happen in certain pH ranges. So your blood needs to maintain a pH somewhere in there. Your blood temperature is slightly higher than your body temperature. Your body temperature normal is on average 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but the temperature of your blood is a little bit higher, like I said. So it's usually around 100.4. And that just is part of the way we maintain our body temperature. In a healthy adult man, blood volume is typically between 5 and 6 liters of blood, or about 6 quarts of blood. And your blood actually makes up about 8% of your overall body weight. So next we'll look at plasma. Your plasma, again, is the liquid part of your blood. Because it is liquid, it's mostly water. It's about 90% water. But there are lots of things dissolved in that water. That's going to be nutrients, such as the nutrients coming from your food in your digestive system. When you absorb that through the stomach and the small intestine, those nutrients go right into your bloodstream. So you will find those nutrients carried in the plasma. You also have salts, which are our electrolytes. If you hear that somebody, their electrolytes are low, or they need electrolytes, that's replacing those salts in your blood that you need for different chemical reactions to happen. There's also respiratory gases. It's going to include oxygen and carbon dioxide. Your hormones will travel through the plasma in your blood. There are proteins as well, plasma proteins, most of which are made by your liver. So the liver does more than just help with digestion. Those proteins will include clotting proteins, so they help your blood to clot. And then waste products are also carried in the plasma of your blood. The formed elements, again, are the blood cells that we have. You have erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, or we call those RBCs. Leukocytes are your white blood cells, and we call those WBCs. And then you have platelets. Their actual technical name is thrombocytes. And those are just cell fragments, and we're going to go through and talk about each of those individually. We're going to start with our red blood cells. So your red blood cells, or erythrocytes, the main function of them is to carry oxygen. If you were to look at a red blood cell, and we'll look at some on the next slide, the main function, again, no, I'm repeating myself, sorry. The main function, again, is to carry oxygen, and its structure, which is what I was getting at, helps it to actually carry oxygen. The structure of a red blood cell is a biconcave disc. What that means is that it's a disc, so it's circular in shape, but on the top and the bottom, it's kind of indented. If you think of, so not a lifesaver where there's the hole in the middle like the candy, but a breath saver. I don't even know if they still make those, but they're mints, and like the center of them is indented, but they're filled in. That's similar to the shape of a red blood cell. Really, your red blood cells are just bags of something called hemoglobin, and we'll talk about that separately in a minute. Your red blood cells are anucleate, which means they have no nucleus at all, and we'll come back to what that means for the red blood cells a little later on in this lesson. They have very few organelles, actually. In 1 drop of blood, on average, you should have about 5 million red blood cells. Here we can see all of the different types of formed elements in the blood, but all of these reddish circles are your red blood cells or the erythrocytes. If you see this lighter circle in the middle of them, it's going to be thinner there because it is indented. That does let them kind of fold in half as they travel through our smallest blood vessels so they can move through. You can see some of the white blood cells here. They're stained in this image. This would be from a microscope slide if you were to look at a blood sample. And the white blood cells, again, even though they look purple, you can see they're much larger than the red blood cells. And then these tiny little pieces, which are also stained on this slide, are the platelets. Those, again, are just fragments of cells. So here we are back talking about hemoglobin. It is a protein in our red blood cells. It has iron. So if you have ever been told or heard that somebody's iron is low, that is going to affect their hemoglobin and their hemoglobin's ability to carry oxygen. So this protein that you need iron for, so reasons why we need iron in our diet are to have our hemoglobin be able to carry oxygen effectively throughout our body. It does bind very strongly to oxygen, but reversibly. That means that when it gets to our other cells in our body, it's able to release that oxygen, and that oxygen can diffuse into our cells. Our cells need oxygen to be able to make energy, so that's why it's really important that we have the right amount of hemoglobin, the right amount of iron, so that we can get energy made in all of our cells. Every hemoglobin molecule has 4 oxygen binding sites on it, so one molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So that means that since each erythrocyte has 250 million hemoglobin molecules, multiply that by 4, and that's how much oxygen each red blood cell can carry. In a normal blood sample, if you've ever had blood tests done, part of what they look at is going to be your hemoglobin, and that normal range for hemoglobin should be 12 to 18. So that means you have 12 to 18 grams of hemoglobin per 100 milliliters of blood. Next, we have your leukocytes, or our white blood cells. Again, these are really important in our body's defense against disease, so it helps us to fight off infections. They are complete cells. That means they have a nucleus and they have organelles. They're able to move by what we call amoeboid motion, so they're actually able to kind of like move around and like squirm around kind of. They can actually leave our blood vessels and go into surrounding tissues to help fight infection. It's really fascinating actually how they work. They're able to respond to chemicals that are released by damaged cells. So again, they would then leave a blood vessel and go into that damaged tissue if needed. Depending on depending on what kind of white blood cell, the amount of that white blood cell in your blood sample would vary. But overall, you should have between 4,800 and 10,800 white blood cells per drop of blood. Sometimes there are going to be abnormal numbers of leukocytes, and they can indicate different things to a doctor. So something called leukocytosis would be considered if a person's white blood cell count is above 11,000. What that's going to indicate is usually the person has an infection of some kind, and that would be why they would need more white blood cells at that time. Something else is like the opposite of that spectrum is leukopenia, a person not having enough white blood cells. It's going to be seen in patients that are receiving like chemotherapy, for example, as a cancer treatment. That's going to target cells that are dividing, and your white blood cells are always dividing to replace themselves. You might also see this in people that are taking medications that are classified as something called corticosteroids. An example would be somebody with arthritis. They would get corticosteroids to help manage that disease. And then leukemia, that's something that mostly everybody I'm assuming has heard of before. That is actually cancer of the bone marrow. So that would cause your bone marrow is where blood cells are made. So it causes your blood cell or excess white blood cells to be produced. The reason why that's a problem is that they don't have time to mature because they're produced so fast. So they don't actually work to help that person fight off any infection. Next, we have platelets. Again, the technical name for them, I don't have it here, but they are called thrombocytes. They are going to come from cells that are called megakaryocytes. They kind of break off of that to form these smaller cell fragments, which are what we consider platelets. We need them for the clotting process to happen. So if you were to get a cut of any kind, then that would be needed at that point in time. Your platelet count should range between 150,000 and 400,000 per drop of blood, but right around 300,000 is what we consider to be normal. So what we're going to look at next is called hematopoiesis, and that is the formation of our blood cells. Where this occurs, again, as I just mentioned, is in your bone marrow. You have different kinds of marrow. If you remember from when we did the skeletal system, you have red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. Blood cells are produced by your red bone marrow. They all come from a common stem cell called a hemocytoblast. Stem cells are cells that have the ability to become any kind of cell. So in this case, a hemocytoblast can become any kind of blood cell that we might need. You have lymphoid stem cells that produce your lymphocytes, your white blood cells, and then myeloid stem cells would produce your red blood cells and your platelets. For the formation of your red blood cells or erythrocytes, because, and here's where I told you we come back to it later on, as we mentioned before, your red blood cells are anucleate or have no nucleus. Because they don't have a nucleus, they can't divide on their own because it's the nucleus of the cell that controls that. They can't grow and they can't make proteins. So once they wear out, they have to be just replaced from the beginning. They can't divide to make more red blood cells themselves. They have a lifespan of around 3 to 4 months. And when they are worn out, your liver and your spleen are going to help remove those worn out red blood cells. And then they would be replaced by your hemocytoblasts in your red bone marrow that would produce more red blood cells. What's going to cause that process to happen is controlled by a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is produced by your kidneys mainly, and what's going to cause that or trigger that to happen is low oxygen levels in your blood. So if you, let's say, get a pretty bad cut, you lose a lot of blood, you're not going to have as much blood in your body to carry oxygen. So your kidneys would then produce erythropoietin, which triggers your red bone marrow to make more red blood cells. If you, for example, go to a place at a high altitude, so if you were to go to like the Rocky Mountains, for example, in Colorado, that are at a high elevation, you are going to feel the effects of not being able to use as much oxygen at that high altitude. So if you're there for a prolonged period of time, you're going to, you're going to have your kidneys are just automatically going to produce more of that hormone to trigger more red blood cells to be produced. That is going to be maintained or regulated by negative feedback. So if we take a look here, if we were at homeostasis, that would be having normal blood oxygen levels. If you, here's a few examples of something that would cause low blood oxygen. So you could have lost some red blood cells. You could have decreased hemoglobin, so maybe you're anemic, decreased availability of oxygen. That would be in the example of like a high altitude. Your kidneys mainly, again, are going to produce erythropoietin. That triggers your bone marrow to make more red blood cells. That will cause your red blood cells to increase in count. Oxygen carrying ability of your blood would increase then, and you would be restored to homeostasis, which shuts off the production of that hormone until it's needed again. As far as your white blood cells and your platelets, the production of those is controlled by hormones. So your white blood cells are going to be controlled by something called colony stimulating factors and interleukins. Those hormones get your red bone marrow to make more white blood cells. And then thrombopoietin is going to cause your platelets to be produced. Again, just another hormone. We are going to stop there for today, but you have on the final slide of your notes a question to answer. You're going to list a couple things that you learned new from the lesson today, and then you need to make sure you submit your assignment.